The Motel is a 2004 film directed by Michael Kong and is distributed by Palm Pictures. Michael Kong also serves as the film's co-writer alongside Ed Lin, whose novel Waylaid serves as a loose basis for the movie. The film stars Jeffrey Chow as Ernest Chin, Jade Wu as his mother Amma, and Soon Kong as Sam. The film's plot is rather loose and episodic. We follow our protagonist Ernest as he deals with the hardships of puberty and all the awkwardness and angst that entails. When you're a teenager, the sudden rush of hormones that come with puberty fill every inch of your being with newfound urges and desires that cannot always be articulated. Meanwhile, the very wants and desires that can be named always seem to go unfulfilled for one reason or the other. And yeah, for most of us when we were teens, we were stuck vacillating between the disappointment of not being able to get what we wanted and just being angry for not knowing what exactly it was that would actually satisfy us.
Your dick is hard. That means you love me.
That is to say, growing up is already hard. Puberty sucks, even under the best of circumstances. However, Ernest is not even in the best of circumstances. He lives and works in a seedy hourly rate motel owned by his family. And he shares his living space with his grandfather, played by Stephen Chin, his younger sister Katie, played by Alexis Chang, and his mother, played by Jay Wu. We never learn much about Ernest's father, and it's noted later in the film that Ernest doesn't even know who he is or whether he is even alive. The first major thing we do learn in the film about Ernest is that he's received an honorable mention in a writing contest. This upsets Ernest's mother as she feels that artistic pursuits are a waste of time and takes the extra step of noting that
You did not win. You got honorable mention. That is not winning. That is bad. That is worse than losing.
for what it's worth, I don't think Ernest's mom is some sort of soul-sucking hag or even the stereotype of a quote-unquote tiger mom. She's certainly tough and definitely intrusive. However, it is established early on that Ernest has, like all teens, begun the process of individuating, which entails testing the boundaries of his own independence. The lies of omission act as a barrier, allowing him the space and privacy to experiment and explore his own personhood. Prior to this particular moment, we're shown that Ernest did not tell his mother that school had let out early, and he used the free time to sit in the parking lot of the nearby Chinese restaurant, eating an egg roll and trading glances with Christine, played by Samantha Feuderman, a slightly older female friend for whom Ernest harbors a crush. So, while Alma Chin's baseline attitude throughout the entire film is always a little harsh and overbearing, I think it's fair to give the context in which we are seeing her. Even without the added stress of Ernest and his dishonesty, she does run a motel that caters to a clientele from the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, and for many of whom are at the lowest points in their lives. We are shown that the motel has an ever-rotating cast of prostitutes and johns, alongside financially distressed families who have no other means of housing. It's not a place one can survive with a soft heart. And before I go further, I'm not casting any judgment on the motel's customers. Sex work is real work, and being poor is not a moral failure. I know that if you've grown up in America at least, we all suffer to some degree from a prosperity gospel indoctrination that tells us that our level of material wealth is apportioned by God, and as such, it's a direct reflection of His love or whatever, and thus we moralize concepts like net worth and give them some divine or cosmic connotation. Moreover, I'm not blind to the fact that desperate people behave in desperate ways, especially in the country where class stratifications are becoming ever more rigid and solidified, causing social mobility to become practically non-existent. That being said, I'm not some sex-negative weirdo who believes that sex work would not exist in a perfect world. Rather, the best possible outcome is for someone who engages in sex work is that they do so willingly, with a reasonable set of protections for their health and safety. After all, transactional sex is not even unique to humans in the first place. However, capitalism is. Anyway, upon learning that he has received an honorable mention, Ernest makes his way to the nearby Chinese restaurant where Christine works to not only inform her of his achievement, but to bring her an adult magazine that he has found while cleaning one of the motel rooms so that they can gawk at its content.
Oriental women? This is disgusting. Let's go check it out.
It's at this point that we learn that the only reason Ernest ever entered the contest was because of Christine's insistence. Furthermore, it's stated that Ernest's distinction as an honorable mention recipient makes him eligible to attend an award ceremony and a dinner at some fancy hotel. However, Ernest doesn't have a car, nor is he legally able to drive. Christine says half-jokingly that she should be allowed to tag along to the dinner since it was her idea for Ernest to enter the contest in the first place. And if you're thinking this is the beginning of a poignant coming-of-age teenage road trip movie along the lines of The Wizard, Josh and Sam, or even On Our Own, you would be wrong. The title of this film, after all, is The Motel, and Ernest has lived long enough to accept that the dinner, let alone an actual date with Christine, is just not in the cards for him. Soon after this, we meet Sam Kim, played by Sung Kang. He wanders drunkenly into the motel lobby with an escort in one arm and a bottle of whiskey in the other. Given what we already know about the motel, we know this is a site that Ernest has seen thousands of times before. However, Ernest is distracted by Sam's alcohol-induced confidence and gives him a room key before realizing that the credit card that Sam had given him to rent the room was declined. This leaves Ernest in a bind, as he's too timid to request another form of payment, let alone to go to Sam's room and kick him out. However, Ernest is too scared to tell his mother that he has essentially given a free room to someone. Rather than face the wrath of his mother, Ernest decides it best to just steal cash from his mother's room and place it in the register to make it seem like Sam has paid for his room. When Ernest does decide to confront Sam the next day, Ernest is given assurances that Sam will eventually pay. As a sign of good faith, Sam gives Ernest the Rolex from his wrist as a form of collateral. From this moment on, Ernest and Sam form a strange bond. It's not appropriate to call it a friendship, but it also isn't impersonal enough to simply call it an exchange between a business and its customer. Their respective motivations align in just the right way. Ernest wants to collect the money that is owed for the motel room, and we later learn that Sam is starved for a distraction because of a looming divorce. Throughout most of the film, Sam is in almost a constant state of drunkenness, and between the moments he isn't giving Ernest unsolicited life advice, he is soliciting sex workers. In a way, this makes Ernest no different to Sam than the prostitutes with whom he spends his evenings. Ernest is compelled to offer up his time and attention to Sam in hopes he can finally convince him to pay. Sam's arrival comes at a pivotal moment for Ernest. Ernest is impressionable and young, and outside of his grandfather, he lacks any other male role models in his life. And let me be clear, Sam is not a good role model. However, his presence does embolden Ernest to gradually become more assertive, which isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Being assertive and willing to advocate for oneself is a positive quality, but like all things in life, dosage and degree matters. In a way, there was some prescience to this movie. While it predates the cultural conversation around toxic masculinity being mainstreamed, it does seem to accidentally brush up against it as a concept. And I know, I said a term that is scary to some of you, so we might as well address this now. Toxic masculinity does not mean that masculinity is toxic. That's not the definition. That's never been the definition. That's a straw man, politically expedient reframing of the concept so that it doesn't have to be dealt with on its own terms. Too much of anything can reach a point where it becomes toxic, debilitating, or maladaptive. That's not a controversial nor mind-blowing idea. At least, it shouldn't be once you become as old as the dudes who can't stop whining about it are. In any case, Ernest and Sam's relationship reaches its apex one night when Sam teaches Ernest to drive. Again, that's a positive thing. Ernest learning to drive, acquiring a new skill, all very positive. However, the only reason he's being taught this is because Sam is too drunk to drive, which is not positive, so the context of this matters. It's at this point in the film we learn that Sam is going through a divorce and is using Ernest as a means to try and see his estranged wife. The plan is a bit unclear, but it's important to remember that Sam is very far from sober. And while it may make sense to him in his own head, from the outside it seems somewhat nonsensical. He just wants Ernest to call the home's phone to see if his estranged wife answers it while watching from a tree outside of their home. Don't get me wrong, I've been there too. One of the wonders of inebriation is just the unbridled confidence and sense of self-satisfaction that comes with it. But this also means a lot of bad or stupid ideas never feel that way in the moment. We soon learn that she's not even home, and through a series of missteps involving Ernest's inability to properly use a cell phone, Ernest has inadvertently left a message on Sam's answering machine. Fearing the answering machine may have picked up Sam's voice, he and Ernest break into the home to erase the message. Once in the house, we get a few somber moments of Sam in his old home, lamenting a life he has now lost. It's hard not to feel empathy for Sam in these moments. However, I will stress, we were never given a clue as to why Sam's marriage has fallen apart. All we know is that he's sad. I don't want to take that away from him, but I also don't want to minimize any potential culpability Sam may have had in the failure of his own marriage. I'm not saying he isn't sad, but I'm not saying his feelings are entirely justified either. Without getting too heavy on details, I probably wasn't the best person I could be in my 20s, 30s, or, well, even now, but in particular, during my 20s, I was in a few on and off relationships that were on and off because I never passed up an opportunity for sex when presented. That was wrong, of course, and every time I was caught and the relationship would end, I would become inconsolable. I certainly felt sad, but I really had no excuse to. That is to say that sometimes your feelings are invalid and inappropriate. Just because you feel sad doesn't always mean you've been wronged. Sam has given the audience nothing except his sadness, and so it's hard to truly know if he is deserving of the audience's sympathy. As they drive back to the motel, Sam begins to share his thoughts and philosophy on life in general, resulting in Ernest and Sam getting out of the car to stand in the middle of an empty highway, screaming into the vastness of space, demanding happiness, which, coincidentally describes my YouTube channel perfectly.
I want to be happy! I want to be happy! I want to be happy! I want to be happy!
That night changes Ernest, and whatever reservations he may have had about Sam are dissolved. So much so that he feels comfortable enough to share his fancy hotel dinner-worthy short story with Sam. This stands in direct contrast with how Ernest guards his creative pursuits from his own family. That isn't to say that Ernest is necessarily hiding his art. Early in the movie, it's pretty clear that the honorable mention bolsters Ernest's self-confidence. However, this is short-lived. Even with the recognition of his abilities by way of the writing contest, his family still does not see writing stories as worthwhile or valid. As mentioned earlier, his mother thinks it's a waste of time, and his grandfather thinks the awards dinner may be some sort of scam. To illustrate this, Ernest's grandfather tells him a story about the time he received a notice in the mail saying he had won a television. He relays to Ernest how excited he was, but when he went to collect the prize, the location was just a warehouse where salesmen made various pitches to him, and they kept trying to push him to buy certain things. When Gung Gung didn't make any purchases, he was only given a Phillips head screwdriver for his time. This interaction sours Ernest enough to turn down a ride to the award ceremony that is offered by Christine and her father, because Ernest doesn't actually care about the dinner. He just wants his family's respect. After his night with Sam, Ernest becomes bolder, such as confronting a bully at the risk of his own safety and even trying to rebrand as some sort of bad boy so that Christine may think of him as something other than just a friend. However, the latter move does not quite land the way he wants it to, and as a further humiliation, a crew of skateboarders show up, one of which Christine recognizes from school and seems to have a clear attraction to, even though he can't land this extremely mop kickflip. No, I'm not going to explain what that means. That's for the skaters out there. That one's for us. They are not like us. They are not like us. No sirree. When Ernest follows up with Sam for an opinion on his short story, Sam sidesteps the issue, but does note that the story does make him hungry for Chinese food before getting a bit too, well, inappropriate.
Real cute. What is she, like 15, 16? Nice ass. You know what I'm saying? Don't think I didn't think about it.
And not for nothing, I would also like to note that this is the most sober Sam appears throughout the film. While Sam is less critical for Ernest's artistic aspirations, he is no more enthusiastic about it than Ernest's family are. However, he's able to better obfuscate his lack of support by telling Ernest that writing stories just won't get Christine to like him. Which is true. Attraction in all its varieties is mysterious at best. For the most part, it's irrational, and as such, it defies logic. There's no true formula for romantic or sexual success. There's only best practices. Even under the most favorable conditions, there is always potential for failure. It doesn't mean that if you strike out with someone that you aren't funny, smart, or pretty. It doesn't mean you don't deserve someone to love who loves you. It's just that sometimes you aren't the right person for a particular person in a particular moment. The most you can do is give yourself an opportunity and face the fact that you will get rejected. A lot. This is true regardless of whether your intentions are for hooking up or something longer term. But anyway, with all that being said, Sam promises that he knows a surefire way for Ernest to get laid and offers to give him advice on how to get with Christine. Later that day, Ernest and his mother get into an argument about Sam's lack of payment for the room. Alma mentions that Sam has not paid for the past 3 days. Ernest vouches for Sam's ability to pay, but Ernest's mom counters that the Rolex he was using for collateral was fake. It's hard to know if any of this is true. Sam does seem to superficially have the means to pay. He wears a nice suit, drives a BMW, and the house he had with his soon-to-be ex-wife is actually pretty nice. On top of which, he seems to be able to pay for sex workers, food, and alcohol with ease. As the argument escalates, Ernest storms off and steals his mother's car. With his mother's car now in his possession, Ernest goes to the Chinese restaurant and convinces Christine to get in the car with him under the pretense of going to the awards dinner. At the same time, Ernest's mom finally decides to read his short story. We don't necessarily know what the short story is about. The opening credits of the movie do show truncated passages of it. However, there are very few, if any, complete sentences that are actually shown. But from what can be read, it does appear to be autobiographical. But more on that later. After what seems like hours on the road, Christine is able to figure out that Ernest has no idea where he's going and demands to be taken back home. This angers Ernest because by now it's pretty apparent that he had lured Christine into the car under false pretenses just to get her alone in an enclosed space. Ernest makes an awkward and aggressive unwanted move to kiss Christine, which results in them getting into an argument. Ernest does eventually agree to take Christine back home, but not before stealing a kiss. And it's uncomfortable to say the least. Times have certainly changed since then, but stealing a kiss was romanticized in pop culture for decades prior to this. I honestly can't count how many TV shows and movies I was exposed to where a man just grabbed a woman and kissed her passionately. I'm not saying it's okay, I'm just framing it within the context of its era. There was this terrible idea in pop culture that persisted since even before I was born, but certainly lasted up until my young adulthood, that women were either too indecisive, too shy, or simply just playing hard to get, and so it was your job as a man to just quote-unquote take charge. In this instance, take charge meaning to initiate physical intimacy with complete abandon. The idea being that such bold action will cause the woman you desire to fall in love with you instantly. With Ernest's friendship with Christine damaged, perhaps beyond repair, a sad and angry Ernest confronts Sam as he returns to his hotel room in his usual drunken stupor. Now armed with a baseball bat, Ernest insists that Sam either leave the room or pay. Sam goads Ernest into assaulting him, perhaps as a sort of masculine rite of passage, but also because of Sam's own desire to feel anything other than the constant depression in which he seems to find himself. After a brief physical struggle, Ernest obliges. After a few blows from the baseball bat, Sam declares he's had enough. Ernest again gives Sam the ultimatum, pay or leave. Sam says that if he does pay, he'll never return, in a mistaken belief that Ernest may miss having him around as a kind of role model or friend. This does not break Ernest's resolve. Sam pays in cash and leaves. Ernest cleans up his room, and upon returning to the motel lobby, he is tearfully greeted by his mother, who is moved by the short story that Ernest has written. This in turn causes Ernest to cry. The end. Okay, let's talk about the title of this video. In my plot recap, I purposely kept it race neutral. However, this isn't meant to imply that the film itself is just some race swap plug-and-play variation of every quirky, twee indie dramedy from the early 2000s, because it isn't. Race is an ever-present issue in the film, but not in a pandering or performative way. It's not something I think I can fully elucidate, but as long as I've tried to make it in the creative space as a writer, there seems to be, with some regularity, a yellow-face controversy. For whatever reason, there are white people who really love pretending to be Asian behind a keyboard, and, well, other races too, but I'm going to focus on this particular form of racist cosplay, namely because this is an Asian American film with Asians in key lead positions in terms of writing, directing, and acting, but also because I too am an Asian American. I'm not saying that being an Asian American makes me an expert on such issues. It doesn't. However, I will contend that no one really can be. There's not some sort of monopoly over the identity itself, and I don't mean that in terms of some pedantic scolding like, Asians aren't a monolith. That's true of any group. I just mean that in terms of how varied the cultures are between countries in terms of languages, religions, and customs. We don't share a lot of the same commonalities that other minority groups have that you might think of in terms of how we classify them in the United States of America. For instance, when we say, in the American context at least, Latino, we, for better or worse, assume things about Spanish language, Catholicism, stuff like that. Of course, the people from those countries that make up the umbrella term of Latin America have their own customs and traditions, but we do know they have some shared commonalities due to the brutal legacy of European colonialism. Not to say that European colonialism didn't touch Asia. Of course it did, but just not in the same exact way. My grandparents grew up under colonial French rule, and my parents grew up in the lingering instability that followed as decolonization led to power vacuums and eventually a civil war. French Indochina did, in a way, bind otherwise disparate ethnic groups with different languages and cultures by giving them a common language, or more accurately, forcing a common language on them. Were it not for a few accidents of history, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia could have easily ended up as majority francophone countries. However, the present being what it is, there's not a lot that binds Asians together in terms of religion, language, or even customs. Rather, in America, we are sort of forced together into a group against our will because of, general white supremacy and laziness. As such, the most we have in common quite often is how we are defined by the vestiges of colonialism rather than how we actually relate to one another. This, of course, causes some weirdness and distance amongst us as Asians in America. For instance, when I was in Seattle once, I decided to visit the Wing Luke Museum because, it was just something touristy to do, and on top of that, they billed themselves as the quote-unquote only pan-Asian art and history museum in the United States, which I never checked to verify if that claim was true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. In any case, the museum has all these exhibits separated by countries in Asia with little displays, with factoids and, pieces of art. Every country except one. There is no Laos exhibit. I mean, at all. And I checked for the better part of an hour when I was there. I don't know if this is still true. If it is, a special fuck you to the Wing Luke Museum. Change your museum description to mostly Asian and not pan-Asian. If this is no longer true and there is a Laos display, that's good too. Next time I'm in Seattle, I'll stop in and maybe even buy something from the gift shop. But also on a more personal level, I recall once a Burmese American girl saying to me, unironically, that all Asians celebrated Lunar New Year, which is blatantly false, because as a person of Lao descent, I had only known of Lao New Year, which happens in April, as opposed to the Lunar New Year, which has Chinese origins and is celebrated sometime around late January or early February, I believe. Lunar New Year just never held any importance in my community when I was growing up, at all. However, I feel like she only felt comfortable saying this because, for better or worse, we were both born into this country, and with it comes this perception of a flattened, homogenous Asian American identity that just doesn't exist. And that last anecdote isn't to suggest that all Burmese Americans celebrate Lunar New Year. I don't know if they do. Maybe it was just that one girl. But at the same time, it's not that there aren't some similarities sometimes. For instance, my parents are from Laos. As mentioned earlier, I'm ethnically Lao. A lot of Lao culture is pretty similar to Thai culture. In fact, there are a lot of Lao people that actually live in Thailand. However, for political reasons, they don't really identify as such because of the assimilation efforts of the Thai government. It's just kind of politically expedient to not identify as such. Normally, they end up being called from the Northeast or Isan. It's complicated, but even if we put that aside, a few of the languages in Thailand, when spoken, are close enough to Lao that they can be reasonably understood without one speaker needing to completely learn the other's language. I don't want to go down some rabbit hole about mutual intelligibility between languages, but it's just something that happens in a lot of regions. Besides, I'm not really qualified to do so. And lastly, I've heard of Khan from King of the Hill. I wasn't a huge King of the Hill fan, so I didn't watch that many episodes of it. I did see a few with him in it, and the ones I've noticed that he has a storyline, there seems to be very little understanding of Lao culture and just Lao people in general. Maybe one day I'll do a breakdown of what's wrong with the portrayal of it, but, I'll maybe save that for as a subscriber goal of some sort. Maybe if I get 1,000 subscribers, I'll do that. But as of now, it doesn't really interest me. And I guess as a final disclaimer, when I say Lao, I just mean the ethnicity. It's equally plausible to be from Laos and not be ethnically Lao. There are a slew of other ethnicities that reside in the borders that are internationally recognized as Laos. So you have Hmong people, Aka, they all have their own languages and customs. I just bring this up because I don't want to discount them as not being from Laos, because they are just as equally. because virtually no country on the face of this earth is homogenous ethnically, racially, or even culturally. It's also why the world doesn't have any room for ethno-states. There are simply just too many people and not enough countries, so we just have to get over it. Besides, we already share this planet. And this isn't to say I agree with the concept of borders, but I'm also not willfully blind to the notion that most people do believe in them to the point of violence. So, what do I mean when I say that race is ever present in the film without pandering? It's pretty simple. It doesn't take an Asian American director or writer to achieve this, but unfortunately, projects I have seen that are made by non-Asian directors and writers with American characters of Asian descent, there tends to be this almost reflexive desire to have that person's identity control their behavior, rather than allowing the character to just be normal and whose identity informs how others treat them. For instance, there are moments in the film where Ernest, Christine, and his mother are met with varied levels of racist abuse. It feels realistic in the sense that it isn't treated as a punchline to the scene. It isn't played for shock value, nor does it take time to pander to a non-Asian audience to teach them about racism. The audience should already know that racism is wrong. It's messed up, but it is a fact of living in America. This place might be a melting pot, sure, but the pot we all swim in is white supremacy. As such, most portrayals of Asian Americans in American media are usually just varying degrees of offensive, whether it be an overachieving academic, the coquettish geisha, or the stoic warrior monk. This not only perpetuates harmful stereotypes and encourages an active suspicion of Asians in America for just existing, but it also has a dehumanizing effect within the American culture writ large that conditions a majority of Americans who are not Asian to view Asian men as neutered or Asian women as submissive and quiet. In addition, some of these stereotypes can be used as a shield for white supremacist aims, specifically dismantling affirmative action, but more broadly, it can be used to deny the existence of systemic racism as a whole. The effects of this cultural conditioning also guarantees a situation where the only solution to reconcile the chasm between the fascination non-Asian Americans have for Asian cultures versus their desire to actually see an Asian person can only be achieved through cultural appropriation or pandering. In effect, this means we either remain invisible or comply with the expectations that mainstream America has set for us.
They talk real fast. You know they talk that fast. They talk like that real fast, like do what you say to me like that do.
And it's not like my parents made me do this. It's not like Korean parents make you do stand-up. It's not like I went up to my dad and said, gee, Papa, when I grow up, I'll be a doctor and save lives and heal the sick. Oh, no, you tell Joe.
Listen, I'm sure Kim Jong and Joe Coy go to sleep on big piles of money, and they view that as a legitimate reward for their talent as entertainers, but I mean, I can't. It's not quite blood money, but they have definitely been afforded comfort at the expense of other Asians in America. That's just my 2 cents. I mean, I'm sure they're nice dudes or whatever, but it's pandering. It's leaning directly into caricature and stereotypes while giving permission to a broader American audience that their perceptions of Asian Americans as supplied by the American media is actually true and therefore not worth interrogating. For the majority of my life, the way Asian men in particular were portrayed in American film and television was, and I mean, let's be honest, often still is, infuriating just because there is a weird absence of humanity. In the American imagination, Asian men are, at best, purpose-built androids designed to do math or martial arts. According to the bulk of the American cinema, we aren't even allowed to have the same earthly desires as our compatriots. Rather, the motivations of the Asian male in cinema is the pursuit of an ideal rather than anything concrete, let alone base. At worst, Asian men in American media are just these clowns whose inability to assimilate, quote unquote, properly justifies the racism that non-Asian Americans feel. So when Sam appears in the motel lobby drunk with a prostitute, it's actually quite transgressive. This is why Ernest is, in effect, hypnotized by him. Sure, he has seen this scenario thousands of times in his life, but never quite this exact version of it. Until this point, Ernest's only male Asian role model has been Gung Gung, and while his grandfather is a competent handyman and treats Ernest kindly, he is not someone Ernest can fully appreciate at this point in his life, especially now because of all the new desires brought on by puberty. From Ernest's perspective, Sam is freewheeling, wealthy, and has his way with women. He is the man that Ernest wants to become. Ernest doesn't have the benefit of age and experience to see Sam for what he truly is, which is a pathetic and deeply broken person. Because of this, Ernest has no ability to judge the advice Sam gives him until it's too late. At the same time, Ernest is blinded to all of Sam's faults because, as evidenced by snippets of Ernest's short story in the beginning of the movie, Ernest seems to be starved for not only love, but a social connection and a sense of community. In his story, he notes that Christine and her family are the only other people of Chinese descent that he knows, and he laments that his mother has no interest in ever going to the restaurant or even knowing them. His mother gives the excuse that she just doesn't want to go to the restaurant because she doesn't want to pay money for the same type of food she already makes at home. Within this context, Sam arrives at a moment in Ernest's life where the various stresses of being an outsider coupled with the awkwardness of puberty has left Ernest vulnerable to the influence of Sam. While this, in and of itself, is not unique to the Asian American experience, I do believe that the added desire for community is the missing piece that causes Ernest to gravitate towards Sam. While Sam is not of Chinese descent, it doesn't mean that he cannot relate to Ernest on an Asian American level. In particular, there's this one exchange within the film that I've always found pretty meaningful.
Like this afternoon, I come in Berlin with that big blonde bitch drunk off my ass, and I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, shit, I hope this motherfucker speak English, right? Huh? I'll be honest.
I guess I knew you spoke English.
Really?
Well, I mean, you walk like you speak English.
It's an acknowledgement between the two that they're both aware of the differences between themselves and their own respective ethnicities while simultaneously facing the realities of existing in an American culture that has infected them with all its worst traits. For example, seeing another Asian person in America and then fearing that they can't speak English. America being what it is, it's actually quite common for non-white Americans to sort of internalize the anxieties that the white majority has around non-white people because it's just so deeply ingrained in the fabric of this culture. This is also how you get just these weird conservative pick-me's like Michelle Malkin, Ben Shapiro, or Candace Owens, who just readily accept the narratives regarding their own inherent inferiority and just hope that their willingness to humiliate themselves and grovel before their quote-unquote betters will be enough to be spared the worst of what it means to be living in a society that dismisses the value of their lives and people like them. And, in fairness, it does work. I mean, all those people do live extremely comfortable lives. But that's only because white supremacists love nothing more than hearing their messages come through the mouths of non-white people. I don't know. It's a fetish of theirs. That is why, in my opinion, Sam Kim's scumbaggery is just important. It defies a lot of the implicit rules in American media about what an Asian man is allowed to be. He isn't some celibate overachiever who's on some quest seeking to rebalance the cosmic scales of justice for the sake of some nebulous reward like honor. He isn't some cartoon villain motivated to be evil for evil's sake. He's just some guy living in a self-destructive and fruitless existence full of sex and drugs, and I know that on paper that shouldn't seem like a big thing, but unfortunately it is. In American media in particular, people of color are rarely allowed to just exist on the same neutral terms as their white counterparts, because unfortunately we as Americans are culturally conditioned to view any non-white character in media as almost an intrusion that demands both an explanation and an apology to the white majority audience. Our existence in media becomes debatable in the larger pop culture conversation too often, and too often this lends credibility to further opening that debate about the validity of our existence in society as a whole. While The Motel itself is a flawed film in many ways, I've always thought of it as important, just because it is one of the few portrayals of Asian Americans in a way that felt realistic without the hand-holding and pandering that is so often found in such stories, and I'm looking specifically at you, Joy Luck Club. Even though films like Better Luck Tomorrow and Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle came before it, those films still have a bit of awareness about who's watching it. That is to say, a majority white audience, and as such, it sort of still caters to the stereotypes prevalent in mainstream American culture as a means to both arouse interest, but also to maintain engagement. Don't get me wrong, they aren't necessarily bad forms of representation, but I don't consider them as important. It's just that I have a firm belief that without The Motel, and by extension Sung Kang in general, that Asian American male representation would be stuck in many ways. There might still be the possibilities of greater ranges of representation, but it would perhaps be limited to the safer niche of just having an all-Asian cast or mostly Asian cast. The Motel, however, takes the extra step and actually meets the wider, mostly white American world that we as Asian Americans actually live in without shying away from it. Don't get me wrong, there's still a long way to go, but at least we're moving forward. Yeah, that's it. Like and subscribe, I guess. You know, do what you want. But, you know, I'd like it if you did.